feel free to take a seat as we move back and forth between just over the front. Yeah. So welcome everyone, and welcome back if you were present at yesterday's 2 sessions where we started this exploration of 4 women song composers over the course of the weekend. I'm delighted to see yet more people streaming in and resisting the lure of this unbelievably beautiful spring day. So just to remind you where we were, we got to know a little bit about Margarethe Schweikert, whose professional career was wiped out during the National Socialist years. We also got to know about Elizabeth McConkie, who is present and yet absent. And as I reminded you, we don't have a complete edition, we don't have a complete recording, and we don't even yet have a dedicated biography of McConkie. Today, we're going to explore 2 slightly different figures who present different problems, but as you will have heard, also very different music from what we heard yesterday. And I hope you fell in love with Fanatisme as much as we did when we first heard it. Very gorgeous song. I thought you might also appreciate the original cover of the first publication, unashamedly gorgeous. However, you might also be interested to see that Hedwige Chrétien, a subject of the day, looks absolutely nothing like the woman on the frontispiece of Fanatisme. And I'm afraid I did notice a striking resemblance to Miriam Margolyes, who I believe was educated up the road in Oxford Girls' High School or something. So she's not Miriam Margolyes, I hasten to add, and we should give her her own photograph. So there she is. First, I will tell you a bit about her. Can I please do my usual nerdy thing and have a show of hands for people who, well, unfair after yesterday evening's recital, but who has heard of Chrétien before Mary's recital, Mary's and Anna's recital yesterday evening? One whole person. Excellent. So my mini biography is then not going to be redundant, but prepare to be disappointed because there isn't much to tell. And this is perhaps where Leah is going to help me out. Of course, I forgot to do the thing I should have done, which is to introduce my wonderful co-presenter, Leah Broad, who is writing a biography of 4 women simultaneously. And of course, we have wonderful Sophie Bevan and Anna Tilbrook as our musicians today. Chrétien. What can I tell you about? This is what I can tell you about Chrétien, so you could probably read that and go home. I have looked for a very, very long time. She was born in Compiègne. Her maternal grandfather was a professional violinist, and even as I seized on that fact in my digging, I thought, well, who cares? What difference does it make? Somehow we look, don't we? We look for those traces of musicality in somebody's past as we are constructing the myth of their musicality. Would it have made a difference if her grandfather had been a plumber? I don't know. But I could find this musical fact and I seized on it like a terrier and thought I would present it to you. She studied at the Conservatoire, and again I found my radar on hyper alert. Who did she study with? Who was famous? Who I can present to you? And I kept on thinking about cats bringing in decapitated birds and mice. And sadly, of all of her teachers, the only person she studied with who was famous was César Franck, who's pretty famous. I reckon that's quite good. But I looked at the other names. Louise Aglaé Massard. Any takers? Nobody's going to tell me that they are related to her. That's good. Charles Lenepveu. Nods from the back. Please, can you tell me about him at the end of the session? And Ernest Guiraud, who I had heard of, in fairness. So there are some people there, but there is no lineage here that is easy for me to tell you. She won lots of prizes. One of the difficulties of everybody who studied in Paris is that effectively graduations are described as prizes. One wins a prize for theory, a prize for composition, a prize for orchestration. When you dig down, in fact, you have just completed that course of study. So she did get her prizes as a student. Organ, piano, theory, all of that kind of thing. Organ did strike me because female organists still don't have a terribly easy time of it to this day. So that leapt out at me. In 1886, she won a prize from the Society of the Composers of Music for a lyric poem and a grand solo for tenor, trombone, and piano, which we will not be hearing today. You can complain to me afterwards if you feel shortchanged. She did write a great deal for wind and brass instruments, which is typical, actually, of many French composers of that time. What else did she do? In 1887, she got married. And as those of you who were present yesterday will remember, marriage is always a turning point, frequently for the worse in women's musical careers. They had at least 2 children. That was the most I could find out. Marcel, Cécile, who both became musicians, which is probably why there is a trace of them as people. And she joined the staff of the Conservatoire itself in 1890. And she taught for 2 years. And then she stopped in order to concentrate on her composition. And then she disappears, as far as I can find. What you have is a steady stream of music, only scores, not much else, a little bit in the press, but nothing that brings her to life as a 3-dimensional person. No memoir that I could find, no recollections by any of her friends who had time on their hands. By the 1920s, she's returned to the organ. She's become very, very religious, and she writes a lot of very religious organ music towards the end of her life. This is not a great story, is it? So on we go. She also wrote, in fairness to her, over the course of those quiet years, she wrote around 250 pieces of music, which I think is a good number. I wanted to give you a sense. Do you remember yesterday I showed you the calling card, the visiting card of my first musician, Margarete Schweikert, with the beautiful half profile? This is all I could find of Chrétien, just the name. These are the sorts of covers that the popular music that she was publishing appeared with. Le Petit Soldat. Here's a woman dreaming of, as we can see, some dashing soldiers. Good luck to her. And this is a modern publication which I found, which made me almost crosser than the woman dreaming about the soldiers, because somebody in recent years has published her music, some of her piano music, with that really very absurd cover. But, we'll reserve the rage. We can, however, make some comparisons and build a context for her with some care. This was, of course, a very important time for French music. The early 20th century, we think of Debussy, we think of Ravel, we think of Fauré, and we also think of figures like the Boulanger sisters, whose music has become more and more frequently performed in recent years, and Cécile Chaminade, about whom I hope I can persuade Sholto to let me do a dedicated session like this. Please use your audience voice to make that happen, because her songs are really very beautiful and worth hearing in their own regard. But there are problems with both of these comparisons, and this is again a point I've been trying to emphasize over the weekend. While we can invoke a category, women composers, in the end they are all individual, and their stories diverge in interesting ways. So, for example, our Boulangers are very famous. And we could say, as many French music historians have done, that our duty to gender equality has been fulfilled by the prominence that the Boulangers have in our music histories, mainly because they were associated with famous men. Nadia Boulanger, of course, was a great teacher throughout the century. If you'll allow me one digression about the Boulangers, does anyone here know about their parents? So this story absolutely floored me when I found this out, that their mother was a Russian vocal student, a supposed princess, although her aristocracy is called into question by lots of sources. She was 19 years old and came to Paris, and she married Ernest Boulanger, who was 43 years older than she was. When I told this to my older son, my teenage son, he said, oh, he was 43 and she was 19. I said, no, he was 43 years older than 19. Far be it for me to judge. Perhaps it was an absolutely blissful marriage, but there are certainly some interesting gender and power relations in the Boulanger household that I think have been overshadowed in history. I have yet to see a Boulanger biography which questions what that household dynamic might have been like. That's my first mini digression. And my second mini digression is about Chaminade. Chaminade was enormously successful, financially extremely well off. She bought a gorgeous estate in Monte Carlo to which she retired at one point in her life. She got so much hassle from the press for being unmarried as she inched through her 30s and onwards, that she acquired a husband who was a music publisher based in Marseille and arranged with him a fabulous agreement by which he would stay in Marseille and she would stay in Paris. He was also, I think, at least 21 years older than she was. And he very obligingly died 7 years later, leaving her a respectable widow, after which the press did not harass her about her singleness again. Interesting, I thought. So yes, those are my two digressions. What I've done just now, I hope, is to open up different models of how women's lives can be framed. And of course, I have chosen my information to provoke as much as anything else. What I want to do now is to hand over to Leah, who is doing this on a much more demanding and impressive scale. No pressure, Leah.
Thanks.
Talk about your project for a minute.
Okay, so it's, yes, very interesting. Thank you, Natasha. So the reason why I'm here is because I've just finished writing a biography of 4 women, one of whom is Ethel Smythe. Can I do a show of hands on Ethel Smythe? Who's heard of her? Hey, there we go. Who is, you know, within the sort of sphere of women composers, incredibly famous. The second one is Rebecca Clark. Yeah, again. Third one's Dorothy Howell. Okay, and then fourth, Doreen Cowithan. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I'm sort of grappling with all of these, and I think it's one of those where, you know, I went to the publisher and I said, I've got a project for 4 women composers, and they went, fantastic, yes, write it. And I wonder what they would have said if I had gone to them and said, I have a project or a group biography of 4 men composers. Because, as Natasha was saying, these women led incredibly different lives, even though they were all overlapped. And yet, we sort of expect that there will be some similarities, and that, you know, there are some sort of commonalities, particularly around marriage, that crop up repeatedly in these women's stories. But actually, I think sometimes what we can lose when we think about sort of composers as women is lose the fact that they are individuals as well. And so when we talked about Hedwige Chrétien, this idea of a boring life came up, and I'm gonna kick back against this idea of the boring life, because so the biography I'm writing, Dorothy Howell, is probably the most comparable to Chrétien, where so she was Roman Catholic, she remained single all her life, she had no children, she wrote, you know, 300-400 pieces of music, some really large orchestral works, and that's sort of what has been said about her. But so in some senses, although I think my publisher might have laughed at me if I said, I'm bringing you a biography of 4 men composers, but we have a standard, a model that we have for biography that says this is what an interesting life is. They go and study with somebody famous, they go away, they do exciting things, they travel a lot, and then they come back and they sort of hit the stages publicly with these huge orchestral works. That's what an exciting composer's life is. But a lot of women weren't able to access that type of life. And so I think for me, when I've been writing Dorothy Howell as writing this quieter life, I think is to find the beauty and the excitement in these models that are not, they don't fit the biographical standard for men. But what they do is give us an incredible insight into the variety of possibility and the variety of experience in women's lives in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century. And certainly for Chrétien, I mean, getting married and having 2 kids, that's a big journey. For me, that's something incredibly exciting, incredibly challenging, that she's having to balance this career, that she writes all these works in a context where it's really quite difficult for women to do this at all. She's an organ player, as you said. That in itself tells you something about this woman. She is obviously not somebody who will sort of conform to expectations, who will sort of, you know, accept what the models laid out for her are. So hidden in this is a very, I think, quite determined and quite extraordinary woman. And I was really struck by this song where there's this key change on Baiser. And of course, you know, she's working in the context where, you know, that's not an uncommon thing to do. But that's so moving. I was just hearing that and I thought, okay, what kind of person is it who we're actually hearing through these notes and through these sounds? And she sounds to me really quite a surprising individual indeed. So then the question is, okay, what do we do when we're presented with, as you were saying, just scores and little else, which is such a common issue. And I think we sort of, can we go back a couple of slides actually?
What do you want?
To the, this one, that. Because actually the scores are telling us a huge amount here. Because this tells us, okay, how she's being marketed, the kind of person who her publisher is wanting to project her as, the kind of historical trends that she's playing into. This sort of very, very, almost quite stereotypical design. This is a popular song. This is a song that you don't sort of decorate this beautifully unless you expect it to sell well, right? So she's clearly, we can start out with the scores and go, okay, visually, before we even hear anything, what are these telling us about the woman who we're presented with? We can then start to go, okay, well, what text is she setting? This tells us a great deal about her aesthetic sympathies. What kind of trends is she working with? And then I love the idea of Frank being the like appropriately decapitated mouse in the kind of auction of famous teachers. But it does, again, we can sort of start to work there. Okay, what might she have been taught? How can we start to piece together something of this one? And then going back into her family, I think it does matter that her father was a musician rather than a plumber, because something that I think we really need to start paying attention to when we're talking about these women and actually how it's possible for them to have the careers that they do. The majority of women who have successful careers, they will come from some kind of middle class background. A lot of them come from performing arts backgrounds. It's actually incredibly difficult for a working class woman to be able to have a musical career, just because it costs so much to be able to learn an instrument, to be able to go to these conservatoires. So we do need to dig back. We need to look at their parents. We need to look at, okay, who are they learning from? Very often with these women, their parents are their first teachers. And without that, they wouldn't stand a chance of becoming musicians at all. So I guess we just have to start. What I love about sort of studying these women is reading between the lines, because so I wrote my PhD on Sibelius, and everything is beautifully catalogued and meticulously kept. Anybody who knew Sibelius in his lifetime will have written something about it, so you have a vast wealth of material to work from. Whereas when you're working on women composers, unless it's Ethel Smythe, who is the opposite problem, where everybody wrote about her, and you're like, I cannot read another socialite's diary, please make it go away. But it's sort of reading between the lines, reading in the gaps, and I think this is such an exciting moment for history to sort of go, okay, what are the stories we don't know? What are the stories we haven't told yet? How can we find these stories and make them interesting and beautiful, and find the people who have left so very few traces at all? But we have in fact more in some ways to even begin with than I think we do for a lot of women who, you know, got married and they stopped composing altogether. So I guess I would.
You would look at it more optimistically than
I'm a very optimistic person.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll draw inspiration from that. And what we're going to do now is exactly the same model that we had yesterday. We're going to hear some music. Today, our male musical wallpaper is Berlioz, who is going to set the scene for Chrétien. We wanted Berlioz because he presents some of the musical traits that prepare us for what the melody's unique characteristics are. So flexibility of phrasing. You'll never find two phrases which are the same length, and that gives French song its unique plasticity, that sense of not breaking the bars into regular time. Unexpected turns. It's really not possible to think the way Berlioz does. But equally, when you hear Fanatisme again, which you will after the two Berlioz songs we're about to hear, perhaps you will recognize that she does similar things, taking turns, moments, permissions that you wouldn't expect, even if you have placed her in your head in a category of light music. And we could have a very rich discussion, I think, about what light music is and where its boundaries actually stand, and actually how many of us really like light music. But that's for a different day. So let us have two Berlioz songs, and then we will hear Fanatisme again. So over to Sophie and Anna. Thank you.
Au miroir
I hope you could hear some of the things I was talking about, the irregular phrases, the way that corners are turned in ways that we don't always anticipate, the sensuality of that musical world. I think there are relationships that we can build between music which is familiar and music which is new to us. As those of you who know me will know, I am almost more fascinated by audiences than I am by music itself. And I always perceive that sigh of recognition that ends a song that is a repertoire standard, which means that as Sophie and Anna finish Villanelle, I could almost anticipate the that comes at the end. And then a slightly less enthusiastic at the end of Petit Oiseau, which is heard less frequently. But I'm hoping that by repeating these songs in these sessions, that you will come one step closer to coming to the end of a song like Fanatisme and thinking, wasn't that lovely? Not only wasn't that lovely, but I know where I am in this music. I feel I am at home in this music. So for me, and Sophie will forgive me because I prepared her that I would be rude about Berlioz, I have been listening to Berlioz's songs with true dedication and tenacity for many, many years. And still, at the end of Petit Oiseau, that little perfect cadence, which Anna is very cooperatively going to play for me now, just a little. Yeah. Oh, no, it's a 5-1, isn't it? Isn't it a standard? Oh, says Anna. That was very mean of me. I didn't warn her.
Oh, sorry, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, because I knew it sounded very silly. And it has not yet become possible for me to hear the ending of that song without thinking, what a shoddy piece of composition, I'm afraid. That is not a great way to end an otherwise really charming song. Methinks, but look, I'm always happy to have an argument, so find me afterwards if you want to persuade me of the genius of that 5-1 cadence at the end of that. Not to say that I have to gun Berlioz down in order to find space for Chrétien to emerge, but I want, after we've talked a little bit more about sources and biography, to workshop some of the thornier points, the trickier points in one Chrétien song in particular, in order to show you that really no song sings itself. There is always work to be done to turn notes on a page into something beautiful. And that doesn't matter if you're Schubert or Berlioz or Chrétien or whoever. The real work is done by these people, and it is a negotiation which is constantly shifting. So what we are going to do is show you what some of that work is like, focusing on a point which we discussed at some length yesterday, and we will invite you to tell us what you think works. But before we do that, I would like to whet your appetites by telling you that she wrote over 70 songs, Chrétien. So for those of you who love French song, there is a treasure to be discovered slowly over the years to come. They're all written between the mid-1890s and the early 1920s, after which, as I said to you, she turns to organ music. So I do think that is a particularly beautiful moment in French song. That's its glory age. You can also have an argument with me about whether French song remains beautiful into the 30s and 40s. So, we can always negotiate. Sources. So we've talked about marriage, we've talked about education, we've talked about children. These are the markers of many women's lives. The bit that worries me is the blank 20 years in between where I can't find much. So this is a mean question, really, but what would you do as a historian, as a biographer, who has now has successfully done this for your 4 women? What would you say if people said, well, I want to find out, I'd like to know more? Where would you go?
Well, I mean, my first question would be, how familiar was she with Dupart? Because her songs sound very similar, those little turns of phrases. But I mean, so, you know, with Chrétien, we're in a relatively lucky position that she actually had quite a lot of music published. And often when you're working on figures who were even, you know, sort of who have been pushed out of the limelight since their death, you are really sort of fighting the tide of people binning things. And I've just come from an archive, a very famous archive, where I asked for these boxes by a woman who I'd never heard of, 20th century composer, and I said, oh, okay, well, who is she? And the archivist said, oh, I don't know. We nearly binned it when it came in because we didn't know who she was. There's nearly 100 works, and I've just finished cataloguing them. And there's some really interesting stuff in there. But this is what we're fighting, the sort of tide of things being binned, things being thrown away, things being sort of left in people's attics and not realizing what they've got. So if you're one of those people who has something in your attic, please come and talk to me, because you find the most incredible things in the most unexpected places. But so what I do when I'm faced with an archival silence is I go to newspapers first, and I try and see whether there's any kind of adverts. Sometimes can be incredibly helpful, which might help me match up what has been left out of an archive versus what was sort of going on at the time. I try and find absolutely any trace I can of people they knew, even if it's not necessarily her, but their sort of friend circle. If we can start tracing them through that, we can go, okay, what were they doing at the time? Is there any way I can find through diaries of people who you've never heard of? But sometimes if they're men, it's more likely that their diaries have been kept somewhere in a library, and you can go and look at the diary, and it takes an awful lot of time. And so this is something that people often say to me is, oh, why can't we just play these works more often? Well, the amount of work that it takes to actually get some of these scores, if they were published but now out of print, out of an archive, or indeed just locating where these things are in the first place, that's an enormous amount of work and a huge challenge, but a very exciting one. And so then we can start to, I think we have to sort of try and be inventive, use archivists, who are sometimes incredible, and they'll say to you, oh, there's this box that nobody's looked at in 150 years. Do you want to look through it? And sometimes you can find things. So I think you just have to keep open as much as possible. But it is a problem when you're sort of faced with these sometimes vast stretches of time where there doesn't seem to be much. And I think then the only thing you can do is sort of try and come at it from the outside in and start to place them in a broader context, because sometimes you just won't find anything. You will look and look and look, and you won't be able to locate exactly where they were in these sort of 20 odd years. And that's something I think I've had to learn as a biographer, is sort of embracing lacunae and accepting that you won't be able to find everything for every single second, but that doesn't sort of stop you sometimes speculating or finding what tiny traces you can. You can sometimes find a lot through the tiniest things. But the biographer Hermione Lee, who is an absolutely wonderful biographer, I was reading one of her books about writing biography, and this has stuck with me for years, is she says, well, biographies are more like, if you imagine them like a net and you're reeling in information, ultimately you realise that biographies are holes held together with string, not the other way around. And that has really stuck with me, because sometimes you can't know everything. And this is why I particularly love working on the 20th century, because what I do when I have a gap is I go on Twitter and I say, does anybody know this person? Does anybody know their kids? And sometimes you can find people who happen to have had, a conversation with them in the 1950s, but they will now come and talk to me about it, and that's wonderful. But yeah, I think you just have to be as inventive as possible. I don't know whether that...
It's part of an art, and actually, in a way, those of you who know me, you know that I'm a Brahms scholar first and foremost, and like the Sibelius world, every single scrap of paper that man left on this good earth is catalogued, digitized, analyzed. The small Brahms bibliography is at 3,500 items. The big Brahms bibliography is well over 10,000. So that can perhaps lead us to the illusion that we know that person completely. which is the opposite problem, perhaps of over-documentation and therefore an assumption that there are no more questions to be asked about someone, that judgments have been made. So perhaps we can turn this problem on its head and use it as an invitation to also reconsider people who we think we do know and look afresh. All of which to say we're going to have a bit more music now, because ultimately we do have the scores of Chrétien, so that is our starting point. By the way, if you are curious, her music is held at the Bibliothèque Nationale, so those of you who are deep of pocket can go and get it, because it's extremely expensive to get copies, and it is also held in the Women Composers Collection at the University of Michigan. So those of you who want to investigate, please do. What we're going to do now is hear two songs from the cycle which was performed at the start of yesterday evening's recital, for those of you who were there, the Petit Poème du bord de l'eau. And I am going to go to the texts, if you will give me 1 second. Et voilà, this is the first one. So what we will do is hear the two songs back to back, and then we are going to look at Livet for 5 minutes. Thank you, Sophie and Anna. I'm sure you heard it is quite fragmented. There are changes of texture, and I'll show you the 2 pages of music so you can see, which are quite difficult to make sense of. The first thing I did when I was trying to figure out what was going on over the whole set of songs was exactly what Leah advised, which is look at the poet. So this is what I found when I looked at the poet. He wrote thriller novels alongside other things. It looks like they're having a terrific time at this ball, pendant le bal. He wrote all sorts of stuff, and he's in a way just as elusive a writer as someone like Chrétien herself, because he moves between the serious and the light. He moves between somebody who has to make a living and somebody who has something artistic that they wish to express, and somebody who also thinks about the art of writing. He wrote all sorts of stuff. She also wrote important pedagogical works, particularly around the organ and things like that. So I'm afraid Fortolis did not tell me an enormous amount to help with this. But when we were looking at the music yesterday, and please accept my apologies if you don't read music, please don't worry, because Anna and Sophie will perform lots of bits. We can't spend time on all of it, but there were things that we talked about, and hopefully Anna and Sophie will help me out in this as well. For example, how do we hear that introduction? What is important in the introduction when she has given us no hierarchy of material? Anna, would you be very kind and take over for a minute just so people can see what the possibilities might be for those bars before Sophie comes in? You can also speak. Or Sophie can if you choose.
Yeah, no, I think for me it's looking at the poem and thinking, how am I going to set the scene? When you have an introduction, when I have introductions, I kind of think, okay, I've got the opportunity to kind of set the scene in terms of the colour, whether it's a stillness, a calmness, or whether there's immediate drama, or whatever that might be. And for me here, it's picturing a sort of not necessarily bleak, but a very cold cold landscape, and the sort of stillness and the sound of when it's snowed and it's icy and things. You have this amazing kind of silence you often hear. And so for me, it's kind of creating that as a kind of layer of sound for then the text to be sung on top of.
That's one thing I found interesting was that I sort of come in a bar early,
Yes.
as it were.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah.
I think she wants there to be a sense of something unexpected in this song. You expect with that introduction when I start that it's going to be something heavily romantic, but actually it's not. It's sort of eerie and frozen. And
Can we just help our audience by having, if you could busk a fourth bar, as in do the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then Sophie would come in, and then do the 1, 2, 3 as notated, and Sophie comes in. I hope you can see why I'm wanting to do this with you, because we are teasing out possibilities as composers. We are imagining us to be her when we perform this music. So let's see what she could have done. Stop there and then hear what she actually did, just to remind listeners. It makes me, sorry, Sophie, thank you. It makes me think of old-fashioned sewing. If you sewed well, your seams were invisible. If you sewed badly, you could see exactly where the joins of the thing that you were sewing were. And she is eradicating for us a join very elegantly there. So we see an untroubled landscape, I think, rather than here's the key, here's the tempo, off you go, which was the purpose of many musical introductions in many, many songs that we hear and love today. But the bit that really we talked about for a long time is the bit I've put in a red box on the second page. If we could go from the più vivo and just remind people, we could stop at the end of I can't even see it here. Exactly. À geler.
Les poissons bleus ont fui dans les algues serpentines. Il a pris vers
etc. So, it's an awkward little bit. And I wonder if the two of you could give us some of the things that we tried out yesterday when we were thinking, what is she trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, it's asking yourself the question of why is she written it like that? Why that bar that I have, the second bar of the marked, it's very curious in terms of the text and what she's trying to depict and therefore for me how I play it. She's been quite specific in terms of the articulation marks and the staccatos and the pedalling. And yeah, so we were asking ourselves the question of, you know, what's it trying to, how to play it.
And there's that problem as well that we don't know anything about who initially published it and all of that. So are they her markings?
Yeah.
Are we able to use our own poetical license and do our own thing like we often do? Or is she written this and she specifically wants you to pedal exactly all those pedal markings that she's put there? And does she want that weird staccato that feels so weird to us?
Yes. With a tenuto, then there's a little accent, then with a slow underneath it, the staccato, then the tenuto, pedaling each beat. There's a lot there.
Yeah, a lot of information.
There's a lot of detail, and I think sometimes you have to look at all that and then make your own decision as performers, because otherwise you can get overwhelmed with information, and at the end of the day we've got to find the music and colour in it. So but it's a tricky one.
I think we decided in the end, if I remember rightly, that ignorance was bliss in this case, because if you don't know, effectively you can do what you please. We can't ask her. Always the huge advantage of working with dead composers is you can't ask them. And we do not have a performing tradition that would allow us to say, Chrétien is done like this. It would be very, very different if this were a song by Debussy or Ravel. But I must hasten to add, not necessarily more accurate. There are mythologies which build themselves around famous composers and all sorts of rules which get trained in at conservatoires, which when you actually drill down are as arbitrary as anything else. So we took the view that she probably didn't have much editorial control because it wouldn't have been typical within a commercial music setup to have the sort of fancy editing apparatus that you might have if you published with Durand, which is the absolute gold standard of French publishing at the time and still holds the copyright for every blessed thing, which is why French music is very expensive. So we decided she's notated something, probably. She would not have had the opportunity to try this music out in concert, which is, again, the prerogative of people who have lots and lots of performances, is you get to hear it, then you get to correct. You get to send your score back and say, actually, that's not what I meant. She probably didn't have that luxury. So we decided to take that as an invitation to do what the musicians chose in the end, which might then be different the next time you do it. And I'd like to finish the speaking bit on that note, and let us close by hearing those last two songs again.
I was just thinking how exciting it is that students hundreds of years from now will look back at this performance and say, that's how you sing those songs.
Bevan said it was so. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Don't go far, because there's another one in an hour's time, and Leah will be rejoining me for that final session on our women composers this weekend. But thank you so much to Sophie and Anna for putting in the work, coming in and singing and performing those beautiful songs for us. It makes, as I hope I've shown you, all the difference to the kinds of judgments that you might want to make about this music. The theme of our final session will be the making of judgments, so I hope that will tantalize you back in the room after an hour in the sunshine. Thank you, and see you later.